everyone. We're back with our third episode of the Utility Strategy podcast, the first construction podcast to shine a light on what we love to call utility strategy. As we all know, buried utilities pose an enormous risk to any construction project, often causing schedule overruns, unexpected costs, and of course, utility strikes. But with the right utility strategy, we're able to mitigate that risk and streamline our project. And that's what our podcast is all about. Sharing and gaining all kinds of insights that will enable just that. Helping project managers, utility coordinators, estimators, mappers, planners, designers, engineers, and any other stakeholders overcome the challenges of buried utilities in our site or in our right-of-way. Having said that, today we're going to be doing something a bit different. We're going to take a step back and take a look at the construction industry as a whole and how emerging technologies can change the way we've been doing things since practically forever. And to help us do that, we have here with us today Hugh Seaton, which I hope you're all following his content on LinkedIn. Hugh is the General Manager of Crosswalk by CSI. He's the author of the Construction Technology Handbook and publisher of both the Construction Future podcast and Construction Technology Quarterly, which is awesome content. Prior to CSI, he was the General Manager of Adept XR Learning, a VR AR unit of the Glimpse Group. Hugh has held senior technology marketing positions at Sony, AOL, and he's worked for and with companies like Google, Blizzard, and many others. So, Hugh, without further ado, welcome to our podcast. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, give us some background with your career path. How did you find yourself in construction tech, and what is construction tech actually?
I just want to say one thing. Just the fact that you said AOL is kind of dating him. Along with that, the fact that I know what AOL is, and the fact that he said AOL, it's funny because lately I've mentioned I told someone I used to have an ICQ account, and this kid was looking at me like I was crazy. And I said, "What, MSN Messenger?" And he still was looking at me. And then I said, it's a continuation of AOL and so on and so forth. And he was just puzzled. So it's really amazing how in such a short time, there's been such a paramount shift in names and so on and so forth. And let's look 10 years down the road. No one's going to remember Facebook. It's all Meta. So it's really amazing how things evolve. Sorry, I just had to interject.
That's okay. The fact that you said it's all Meta is a nice pun. So, yeah. Well, to answer, that's great. And I think it speaks to what we're talking about today, right, is how quickly things can shift and how what looks like the immutable bedrock of a technology can change. I know it happens a little quicker with consumers, and the fact that we went from laptops or desktops to phones kind of helped with that. But to answer your question, David, I spent about 20 years in technology marketing. That's where the Sony and the AOL, so you can't quite see the gray here, but I've been around a little bit. About 10 years of that was in Greater China. And while I was there, I started working on BIM and specifically helping companies to market their BIM services. And this was about 12 years ago, that led down a path that got me increasingly involved. I came back to the US in 2012, was part of the founding team of the AEC Hackathon. It wasn't my idea, but I was there to serve pizza. But that really continued getting me excited, and I've run a bunch of events and done this and that. About 7 years ago now, I started a company that I eventually sold to the Glimpse Group. But along the way, we were building some AI voice and some other things that are in the construction, specifically to the construction field. So I was already doing things in AEC generally, but I got very focused on construction as a kind of subset of that. While I was building up that company, I started the process of writing the book and doing some other things, which just got me more and more involved. And at the end of the day, this is kind of the rest of my career. I made up my mind about 10 years ago, but increasingly, more concretely, that if we can solve is the wrong word, to the degree we can make construction, whether it's homes, offices, or bridges and roads, better than it is now, it's a non-negotiable point. Whether it's the price of housing, whether it's sustainability, whether it's climate change, there's 100 reasons why this needs to be increasingly more efficient, more sophisticated, safer, cheaper. And I think that the technology plays an enormous role in that, everywhere from how the field operates to how design gets done, to how specifications are done. And, in the case of what you do, understanding the ground that you're building on and what's you're connecting to and how it's, you know what I mean? Like the context that you're building in is enormously important. I was really excited when you guys came to me and started talking about what you do for that reason, is that it's often overlooked rather, that as well as we do on the field, at the end of the day, you're connecting into a network, you're connecting into a context. So I think all of that feeds together and really lights my fire, obviously.
Well, Hugh, when I listen to you speak, you're always talking about that construction world, that vertical world, that building world, and I know that that is your forte. And what I really like is our connection and how you've actually identified the connection into the network. It's not just that one individual building, but it's everything that's going to connect into, and it's really incredible how things have just evolved over the last 20 years, and especially in the building trends. And you talked about BIM, and BIM was it was never a new idea, but it's a new take on an idea where you're taking things and actually modeling them in real time, building information management, modeling in real time as you're going along, and you could see what will connect into what, how things will actually be built. And now the whole process of automating that and AI is so exciting, especially in the construction world today, and especially in the challenges we have today. Can you talk about just a little bit what you think the meaning of AI would do to the BIM industry and just in general the construction industry?
Yeah, let's start with BIM. One of the things that is, BIM is such a big word, right? But what you think about it in terms of levels of specificity. So level 100 is kind of conceptual, and level 200 is getting close to constructible. 300 is not quite there. 350 is typically BIM detailing. And what BIM detailing often means is it's an easy place to answer your question, because you wind up doing a ton of repetitive tasks. And people are starting to automate that already. And that's a pretty easy start. But the next thing after that is what happens if you put through, and people are doing this, hundreds and hundreds of BIM models through an AI kind of process. And that process will often be group it and tell me what you're seeing, and then we'll use that as tags to then go create a classifier later. I know that there's a bunch of jargon there, but essentially let the data tell you where the groupings and patterns are, right? And then take those patterns and then go and tag things that you've seen so you can start to classify. This looks like a room that you're going to have this problem with, or this looks like, ground where you're going to have these sorts of issues if you build on it. So I think that where AI can go is, and it is going, it's just right now it's hard to share data across projects, even within a company, and across companies it's really hard, and that's a problem that's being looked at. It's thorny. And, a great example, when you talk to folks like Procore, who are, that's a project management software, within one general contractor, getting people to put things in the same way so they can ladder up to a dashboard can take, something like 18 to 24 months. Not all of that is them being slow. Some of it is people aren't going to change in the middle of a project. So if your average project is 18 months, it's a reasonable assumption that you'll be able to really implement in that time. But nevertheless, that's still 18 months. It just took you to have all of your systems in one company talking to each other in a useful way. If you take BIM as a much more complex set of possibilities and, different buildings and so on, being able to aggregate that together so that you can teach a model is a challenge that I think, A, the data is getting better and people are recognizing the need for it. B, people are getting better at translating between tomato and tomato. You have no idea what a big deal that is. That, engineer A calls it a flugel binder and engineer B calls it a flugel binder. And you're like, oh my God, it's just a bolt. That happens all the time. But that's getting better and better. The translators are getting better and better. And the final piece is just kind of the recognition that this is worth doing. And I don't think we're all the way there yet in terms of the legal side of data. I think the industry is just on the cusp of starting to say, we generate a lot of value with this. How are we going to apportion that value, whether it's the owner, the GC, or the subcontractor? So anyway, I really over-answered your question, but I think there's a lot of potential, and as ever, it starts with the data. It's
a fantastic thing. So one of the things I really see the connection between the above ground building and the underground building is the ability for clash detection with BIM. And of course, it's all about understanding staging, all about understanding what is going to work, what is not going to work. And that was one of the most significant things which I saw, especially in BIM, was you were able to stage all your different progress, all your different milestones within a building, and see, wait a minute, if I put in this duct here before I put in the air exchange, would it actually work? Would I have a conflict? And how would I get around it? And really, the truth is, seeing is believing, and having that understanding that you've seen how it should be built, you've seen what would clash and how to actually avoid those. Again, within the construction industry is paramount. Now, a lot of some of the complaints I've always heard is it looks good on a model, but can it actually be built? Can you talk about that a little bit? Because a lot of times it looks great in BIM. Here we go. The engineer designed a 45, 45, 45, but actually you need a 22 and then a 45, and then another 22 and a 22, and so on and so forth. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about the realities of BIM and the realities of supply chain, the realities of all the different things that come into effect when you're doing a vertical construction or heavy construction or civil construction even? Is there?
Yeah, I think there's a couple pieces in there. The constructability has been an issue now that's actually one of the first things we did with our hackathon was start looking at, this is 9 years ago. Clash detection was new then, and it's pretty good now. But the point of constructability is different, because you're asking, what does that mean? And not only constructability, but operability of the building afterwards. Josh Bone is executive director at Electri, which is part of the National Electrical Contractors Association. So as a result, he's spent a lot of time talking to electrical contractors, which is getting to your question. And he was telling me at one point in his career, he was working at a company where every single BIM model they ever got, they had to drop the ceiling 6 inches. Because in a model, it is exactly your point. In a model, it looked great, but the electrical contractors were like, how are you ever going to maintain that or install it or, fix it, whatever. So I think that there is a balance right now between someone who's good at the modeling, the Revit, and someone who actually understands how to build things. And I think a lot of companies that are doing detailing are, I don't want to say struggling, but that's part of their process is, do I pull someone from the field and teach them BIM, or do I teach someone who knows BIM about the field? My personal feeling, the second way is very hard, because the implications in construction, it's like this thing has a knock-on effect on 5 other things that only experience teaches you. So it's not my job, so I want to be careful how strong my opinions are. But I have found that being in the field provides a sense of understanding the interconnectedness of things that's really hard to teach someone in abstract. So anyway, I think what's happening is people are getting better and better at detailing. They're getting better. Most people have a failure or an expensive correction in their past. So they've learned the lessons you're talking about, Ophir, that it may look good, but are the tolerances too, even as much as are the tolerances too tight? You know what I mean? Like the fabricated materials aren't going to be as even as our model says. So we need to allow for the fact that there's a little bit of, a weave, or there's a little bit of variance. And I think that alone is something that takes a minute to figure out. So that was kind of the BIM question.
Let's talk a bit about the heavy civil sector. Hugh, you've touched on this a bit in your quarterly review. What do you think of the specific opportunities in this sector compared to the other subsectors of the construction industry?
I think there may or may not be a really big check that's primarily going at this part of the industry, which could be 200 billion extra a year, depending on where it lands. At some point, someone has to fix the infrastructure. If it's not this administration, it'll be another one. So I think that we don't have enough people at the current level of spending. In some ways, heavy civil can be more automatable because you're often doing big stretches of things. So you may find that robotics winds up finding a place if there is this much money local municipalities decide to spend more to upgrade some of their infrastructure. Because American infrastructure is undeniably in need of more investment and more work, and that's going to come one way or the other. So I think that the industry is going to grow. I think that there's a strong argument for the introduction of robotics for things that are very regular and large. A great example is there's a robot that will do twist tying for rebar, but it doesn't work in small places and it doesn't work in irregular. It's good for big slabs, which I can't imagine doing oh my gosh. So it's perfect because no one wants to do that, and it's big and you can put the thing on wheels and across it goes. Well, that's I think probably a first start, and I'm sure it'll get more and more sophisticated and won't need an acre at a time. So I think that you're going to find technology really finds a place in heavy civil. That said, the people doing heavy civil, whether it's because you're forced into lowest bid and your ultimate customer is a municipality or the federal government, that's probably a countervailing in terms of technology. Because the government isn't famous for being fast at anything. They also have, depending on how the arrangement is, there's a thing called FedRAMP, which is the kind of federal certification that you've got your cybersecurity in order, and it's really expensive. So not everybody's going to be in a place to do that. So I think on the one hand, on the demand side, you've got a lot of pressure towards automating and introduction of new technology. On the same side, though, it's also on the demand side, you have a difficult set of people to sell into. So I think that the need is there. The process of adoption might be bumpier than it might be for building the next Apple store.
You know what? You just said something really interesting, and I was just looking it up a second ago. Isn't there a Congress Act for QBS, qualitative based selection, and especially with ACEC, they were talking about QBS a lot, and then you just said low bid. So how do you see that affecting the industry in terms of, is it an economic factor? Is it a let's just get it done factor? What do you see that they're actually going to low bid versus QBS, and that's qualitative based selection?
Yeah, I think I'm not as familiar with QBS as I am of the reality that governments everywhere are scared to death of looking like they're corrupt. So they'll spend money and waste money to make it not look like they were in any way possibly corrupt. So I think that it depends on who your buyer is. If it's the state with federal funds, again, I'm not as familiar with the QBS legislation, but that may or may not have an impact. If it's federal only, that's a pretty small percentage of direct federal is a pretty small percentage of overall civil, as I recall. Most of it is subsidized by the feds, but is done by states and local, where, again, you have this big issue that, you could imagine someone in Washington not being worried about a bridge in Illinois coming back to them as being, I got paid for that. But if you're a state senator in, someone who's approving a state budget to do something, you're really worried about that. I mean, I've done some work with the University of Connecticut, and they bend over. Oh my God, the number of things, the hoops you have to go through to prove that you're not in any way related. You didn't even have a coffee with anybody that works in the state government. So I think that's not going away. The concern about paper trail and making sure that you absolutely got the best deal. So the qualitative, I hope they can do that, because I think it's a real impediment to efficiency and to better quality, that it has to be the lowest bidder.
That's really interesting. Now, in terms of looking at civil infrastructure in the infrastructure world, and you were saying that somebody's going to have to deal with it. I look at this pandemic as a classic example of us taxing our infrastructure. We went from a work-based economy where everyone was going to the office, they were going to their places of work, to all of a sudden being at home in the work-from-home model, and the amount of tax it actually, or the amount of weight it put on our rural networks and our complete networks was absolutely extraordinary. The fact that we were able to actually do it and adapt and pivot is incredible, but it really highlighted the cracks in the infrastructure world. And the same thing I find with the densification of the urban sector. They were talking about environmental densification, building up versus building out. And now that we had now that we're just almost post-pandemic, I hope that everyone wanted his little piece of the suburban dream. Having a nice big lot and having a nice patio and a nice house to work in versus the condo at home. Versus being stuck in a downtown core with another 1,500 people in a vertical development. So, what aspect do you think that's actually going to bring upon in the civil construction world, or even in the heavy civil or in the building world, from your point of view?
That's a great question. I think they're different, and I think we don't know yet. We really don't. We don't know where it's going to land in terms of what cities make sense and what cities maybe don't need to be as big as they were. I'm in Austin, Texas right now, which is growing incredibly. Now, some of that, and because people want to be near a city, but they don't necessarily want to be paying the rents of some of the larger cities. You say that, and New York had it feels like 2 weeks of panic, and now the rents are as high as they ever were because people still want to live there. So, so the question is, do you need to live there for work, or do you want to live there because there's great museums and restaurants and so on? And I think that's not everybody agrees on that. There are tons of people who love the fact that they've got an acre in Virginia, and they don't, it takes them 2 hours to get to a city center. And then there's clearly 8.5 million people in New York that are okay with everything that implies. I think that the related to that, though, is some of our infrastructure, in particular, roads and bridges get a lot of attention. But, back to New York for just a sec, the rail infrastructure in the U.S. is crazy, especially the Northeast, where that's 110-year-old, a lot of these, of course you guys are aware of this, under the Hudson River, there are 2 tunnels that connect the south of the U.S. with the Northeast. So if you want to get something from southern New Jersey or Virginia or Miami to Connecticut or Boston or wherever, it goes through these 2 tunnels that are from, I believe, 1905, something like that.
Wow. And
we were supposed to fix them, and under the last administration, the budget was stopped. And I haven't heard what's happened. I'm assuming it's rolled into this new infrastructure bill. But the fact that you have 2 tunnels that are responsible for everything that happens, the number of people that go just on Amtrak between New York and Washington is huge, and it's pretty high value traffic. That stops. So I think there's this realignment of economic activity and who goes where is going to have huge impacts. And I think rail is going to be one of those areas where it gets looked at again. I mean, it's so, in America, it's so cargo focused that it really skews outcomes and investment away from passenger rail. But I don't know. I think that there's scope to look at that.
It's funny you say that, because I recall in the last election cycle, I kept on hearing about the Amtrak president, and I had to look into that. And apparently, your current president used to commute from his home riding to Washington every day because he had a young family, and it was really amazing. And the fact that he got the moniker Amtrak president really shows how much he's dedicated to rail. So it's really incredible. So continuing on with that, in terms of investment in infrastructure, and how critical it is to have that infrastructure to connect to that vertical infrastructure, the buildings and all the different things which you deal with, the heavy and civil construction. In order to actually connect into those, you need to have a large enough infrastructure footprint to actually connect into. So, for example, let's take Austin, Texas. It is growing at an exponential rate. And you know what? We're also to blame for that at 4M. I believe our North American office is going to be relocating, or we're going to be establishing our American office in the Austin, Texas area in January. So, but I digress. So again, the whole point of having that footprint of infrastructure and the growth, for example, the basic needs of every municipality and every person living is water, sewer, gas, electrical, telecom, all those different things. And to really meet the need and the growth, you have to expand the system. The system has to be elastic. And right now, we don't have an elastic system. What's your opinion on the elasticity of our system, which is constantly under strain?
I think, it really depends on what part of the system you mean, right? Like in Austin, sticking with that theme for a moment, I had moved down here maybe, 60 days before the freeze last year. So I've spent a lot of time in the North. I was born in the Northeast where we have winters. I've never been as cold as I was in Austin, Texas, because there was nothing to do. Like the roads were frozen over because, of course, they don't have salt here. It's once every 10 years there's snow. You know what I mean? That wasn't a crazy thing. But what had happened is they hadn't winterized key sensors in all of whether it was gas, whether it was actually, believe it or not, one of the nuclear reactors shut down. Of three, one of them did, because the sensors froze. Because, so the point I'm making in that is the flexibility of the electrical grid is, I think, an underappreciated problem. Everyone talks about going renewable, but I'm hearing more and more now that the grid can't handle it. And relatedly, if everybody got an electric vehicle today, the grid couldn't handle it. So how are we going to deal with that? Some of it will be people generating at home, but there's a limit to that, right? And it sounds good until you have to go pay for it or maintain it or clean it or all the other things, as opposed to just plugging it in. So I think our electrical infrastructure has got to get more attention. I mean, that's ground anyway. It's the front line of climate change is delivering electric. It's one of them anyway. Is delivering electric power, and I think that we need to invest a lot in that. And I think it's going to be an ongoing. I don't think it's a one big sum. I think it's for forever. We're going to have to pay more attention to how power goes from point A to point B, especially if we're saying the primary source of power for everything is electricity, which we don't now. We say gas is a big one and oil is another, and sometimes, natural gas. If we're saying everything is electric, that's a fundamental change in how the grid works and whether it even is a grid or is it microgrid. I mean, do we need to have an interconnected grid? Yes, but how does that work? How does that work? How does that work with microgrids? I mean, how do you synchronize all that so you're not blowing up generators? It's a tough question, and I don't know that having it all interconnected the way we currently do is tenable. That's way above my pay grade. So I think flexibility wise, the fact that the electrical grid doesn't blow up routinely is already pretty amazing. Our Austin has a problem right now where you've got a hugely growing number of people that, right, because of the pandemic, don't want to get in their cars as much as they did. But at some point, it will continue to grow, and you're going to see traffic it was famous for the traffic, the pre-pandemic traffic. And that's because there's nowhere to build anymore. Unless you do, Elon Musk talks about boring under, but, even at his best case scenario, it's still a pretty expensive proposition. So no, it's not flexible. The roads are not flexible enough. They're talking about light rail in everywhere, to be honest. It's all over the place because nobody can build roads how many $1 million homes are you going to kick people out of to be able to build an extra lane of your highway? You can't. So light rail gets discussed as a possible way of managing that. We'll see. That's not so easy either.
You know what? It really drew me back to the fact you said you just relocated from the Northeast, from a cold part of the country to a warmer part of the country. What pulled you down to Texas, or was it just a pursuit of work, or was it lifestyle, or what really pushed you to go south?
Yeah, two things. One is an obvious one, and that is, dollar for dollar, you get so much more here. The other one is I've lived in very hot countries. I was in Taiwan and Hong Kong and warmer parts of China. I don't want to be cold again. So it was very lifestyle. I like the idea that, it was this morning, it's November 1st. It was 50 degrees when I went to the gym at 6 a.m. and it's going to be, 75, 80 obviously in Fahrenheit. So I'm fine with getting hot. I don't like being cold. So that was a personal choice.
I believe
if you're convinced it's time to move from Canada to Texas as well.
There we go. I actually remember a quote from a TV show, The Wire. No one talks about a 50-degree day.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
It really stuck in my mind. No one talks about a 50-degree day. A 70-degree day you can talk about. 40-degree you're cold, but a 50-degree day, no one talks about that.
You just grunt and get through it.
Yeah. Well, I've had enough of those here up in Canada as well, and I grunt through the entire winter, but you know what? I don't mind.
Yeah.
I actually have 4 seasons here, and I can differentiate between all of them.
And that's a lifestyle. That's a lifestyle thing. I think personally, I think leaves are great in photos.
Continuing your line of thought on the grids and how important they are, to give the guys credit, like I've seen PG&E's CEO talk a lot about undergrounding and burying the utilities, basically, because they've had so much challenges with the fires and with the climate change. I think the industry completely agrees with you. I think they're seeing a growing importance in the grid, and I think that the EVs, the electrical vehicles, I think is going to have a lot to do with that. So
yes, we'll see about the undergrounding. There was a really great special on YouTube about this underground high tension line between, I forgot where it was, in one part of LA to another. So it was like 10 miles. It was a relative, and the amount of expense it takes to make one of those not blow up or cause a fire, because the voltage is huge. So it has to be in a gel, or it's not a gel, it's an oil. But if there's any bubbles in the oil, it can cause a fire. I mean, it's crazy how much they have to do. So I think undergrounding may be a solution, unless there's some technology I'm not aware of. It may be a solution for short hops, but it's not going to. It can't come close to what high tension lines are able to do. And you're right; they keep causing fires in what used to be a desert and is now lush California.
No, that's really interesting what you're saying. So you're saying that a lot of people are for underground. Number one, for beautification. Number two, for lack of contact. Out of sight, out of mind. But the fact that you say that it's a lot more expensive to put it underground versus just hanging it topside. Are we also looking at the overall expense? When I say that, I mean the societal expense, the area which is not going to be able to be developed because of that, and even the expense to the actual natural environment. And what I mean, and of course with the fires and so on and so forth, every time there's a fire, a PG&E has to cut off half a large portion of the state from electricity because they do not want to further any of those fires. So for our going forward, would it not be the logical point, even though the cost is as you I'm going to paraphrase, outrageous? Would it not be for us beneficially to actually take the time and put all these different lines underground?
Don't you think that's the issue with infrastructure generally? It's the tragedy of the commons. That old fable from England where they had a commons where cows could go and graze, but nobody had to pay for it. So everybody bought more cows, and all of a sudden there was no grass. So I think that everything environmental suffers from this, and infrastructure suffers from this. These are all long-term benefits for short-term costs, and that's a tough one. That's what government is for. That's the definition of market failure, is a misalignment of cost and benefit. That's when someone has to step in and say, we're going to do this. And a way to do that is to make the long-term costs more immediate. And that's carbon taxes, that's other ways. And I think, that there's talk about that. It's a tough one, it's a tough one. I will say, the other side of the coin, though, is, or of the argument is, Germany was pretty dramatic in their shift away from coal, such that when they had interruptions in intermittent sources, they had to go buy very expensive coal and wound up skyrocketing their utility costs, primarily, obviously, electrical, but also wound up polluting more than they were before. Now, that was an interruption, and it was they'll get there, but it was also an example of a one-sided set or one-dimensional decision. Is we have to cut out coal, but we're not going to think about the reliability of what we're replacing it with. I mean, I think there was a joke that someone said, they wanted to use sun and wind in a cloudy, windless country. So I'm oversimplifying, and obviously they're not idiots, and they made decisions based on some things, but it didn't turn out that well for some number of years. So I do think that, figuring out how to balance the long-term needs with what's it going to, not only is how do you bring forward costs so it's logical to make a change now, But how do you make that change at scale when you don't fully understand? You know what I mean? Like, we understand the implications of the current arrangement, but a future arrangement has unknown risks, which definitely slows people down. It certainly loses votes.
It's really funny because I see that it's always a Band-Aid effect. Only when it actually hurts do you do something about it.
Yeah.
And because of the political cycles, it's so extreme, going from one hand to the other. And a lot of people would say, we're sick of the political cycles. Let's just get all these things done right now. I know it's going to hurt. I know it's going to cost, but it's really incredible how it's always been a reciprocal cycle. It goes round and round and round. One politician doesn't like the project, he kills it. The other one comes in, he puts it back in. And everything's done so quickly, and it's got to be his legacy project. Yes, we have to get it built now. Let's do it now. Let's do it now. And just time and money and just the amount of effort poured into that one project to be canceled 4 years later is incredible. And it's almost a tragedy of it's almost a comedic tragedy where you keep on going round and round and round.
I think that public sentiment driven by headlines is moving to a place where I do think it will be a little bit less cyclical. I think that the overall trend is it looks like is going towards, well, first of all, just the electric vehicle penetration. Tesla's really pushed that, but now everybody wants. I mean, just the stock price makes every other car company say, "Let's do that." The thing they're doing. Minus the smoking dope on Joe Rogan. So I think that demand alone is going to drive. Maybe it's a crisis, maybe it's a development, maybe who knows. Maybe it's a tax that funds some of this stuff. But I do think that whether it's generational or just how many years in a row do we need to see California on fire to start believing it, and Louisiana, sinking into the ocean, and if you look at Miami Beach, every day they have a flood, every day. And it's water bubbling. It's crazy. So I think that cycle is flattening a little bit. There may be a bit of a rearguard action, to try to slow it. But I think as a society everywhere, we're getting to a place where I do think that spend on infrastructure is going to go up, whether it's climate mitigation or just bridges that don't fall down.
Hugh, how taking us back to the technology conversation, how do you see companies, and let's call it industry leaders, taking advantage of the upcoming technologies? Like, what do you see as the best practices of doing that, and what should companies be not only looking for, but looking out for?
So I think what you've seen over the last at least 5 years, but I hear that number a lot, 5 years, is contractors have started getting more and more sophisticated about how they manage this increasing flood of solutions. So, a couple of big exits. I mean, look, first of all, people said, "Ooh, there's an opportunity. Let's go make some stuff." But also consumerization of software meant that there were people doing things on the field 5, 6, 10 years ago anyway. As soon as the iPhone became really viable and apps became really viable, people started doing things in the field anyway, which drove one wave of innovation. At the same time, some of primarily the accounting software drove themselves into the field as well. You got some exits. PlanGrid made $800 million, I think it was. There's a few others like that. So now there's all these startups that are trying to get into construction. And as a result, contractors have said, not only could this be a table stakes, forget about being better than others, it's at least this good we have to be. So most of them have an innovation team that is a conduit to kind of survey the world and understand what's out there. But they're also surveying internally. Year one, they often don't. But by year two, they figure out, we should probably understand what the project teams need. So usually they all get there. So they're surveying so they become kind of a market maker almost, where they're understanding what the demand is internally and what the supply is externally. And I've found some of them in terms of best practices is using knowledge management software, so things that can keep track of 400 softwares that they may or may not be using, or if you're a larger contractor, you'll often have 20 or 30 pilots going on at once, like one project, and one project. How do you keep track of all that? Well, again, knowledge management software is built for that. that's a best practice that I see in some and don't in others. The other thing is really beginning to understand what metrics you put into a pilot. Whereas, in the beginning, people don't do that. In the beginning, they just say, try it, work on Fred's project over there and see how it goes. Now they have standard metrics and a process they go under. The third piece that's really interesting from a best practices is, what do you do with a successful pilot? So companies, Flora was doing this really early, where they had actually a process where they would do videos and they would essentially create internal marketing to say, this solution has spent 6 months or a year with us. Here are the results. Here's where it's applicable. Check it out. If you want, call this person and they'll connect you. So I think that on the one hand is standing up a team to play that market maker, then understanding how pilots are run well, and finally post-pilot, what do you do? Most contractors are a little averse to real enterprise agreements where everybody has to use this. Enterprise agreements often are, this is our approved list and we've negotiated a price reduction. Because again, it's so project-based, and projects are so, the discretion given to a project manager who's trusted to run that project is so much that they tend not to want to insist somebody use one. I mean, it happens, of course, but most of the time, a lot of the time anyway, I don't want to be too, sweeping in my statements here, but I see over and over again enterprise agreements that are not a guarantee it'll be used, but they are a guarantee that it'll be considered and that you'll get a certain price.
It's really funny you say that. One of the things I've learned over my years, right through and through, is the hardest thing in change management is actually change.
Yeah.
And I a couple of years ago, I did a course. The company I work for brought in a full learning module with Harvard Business Publishing, and they had entire modules based upon change management. And as well as Crestcom, where I did the leadership program there, again, everything was about change management and managing change and leading change and how things are going and how the evolution going forward has to be based upon change management, accepting the change and actually adopting the changes. So it's really an amazing thing. Like you said, it's all about change management. It's all about understanding how the wheel is turning. And I really like that. And I'm going to take that away, and I'm going to really start researching that again, just seeing how the construction industry, you've given me a nugget here to take a look at and really go forward and try and compare what we're doing in the utility industry and the mapping industry to what's going on in the actual construction industry, and that focus on getting more efficient and really understanding the metrics of construction.
Well, I think what's happening also from a change management standpoint is it's a new muscle for contractors. They're very flat organizations that are not, well, almost by definition, not hierarchical. And as a result, they don't necessarily think about leader-driven change. Whereas in a Procter & Gamble or a utility maybe, you do have a hierarchy and you do have goals set at the top that are relevant to everyday work. And that's happening in construction, but that's not obvious how a contractor would organize themselves. They have some policies, they have some, especially financial policies, some quality policies, some safety policies. But in terms of how you do your work, you're given a lot of discretion, not least because every building is a prototype, and building something in Florida and building something in Manitoba is a little bit different. So
but
I think that this
connected though.
Say again?
Isn't that all connected? The procedures which are dealt with from the company or which are given from the company are all about safety, are all about procedures, and all about metrics on how to do things. But isn't that all interconnected? Isn't that the way the company has become who it is today, by all those different items interconnecting?
I don't know. I think it was, a lot of it was hiring the right people and having some core approaches. And smart people at the top who won really, really big business that they then grew into the ability to do. I think that the idea of, again, when it comes to things like safety and quality and finance, those three, you can't survive without some standards there. But in terms of what scheduling, how to schedule things, how to interact with your data, or how to deal with technology and so on, I think that that's one of those areas that you're finding an increasing. The top is either focusing on it or not, and it's almost a stark difference I'm seeing across companies, where the top may or may not be saying it, and in some cases they're really investing in it, and you can see that difference in how they behave and what they're onboarding.
Hugh, why do you think it's taken so long? Like if we're saying that there's so much freedom of management in each project, basically, why aren't we seeing more technologies involved in projects? Like why is it so hard?
I would challenge the premise a little bit. There's a ton of technology, and in fact, the number of pilots going on in a $2 billion contractor, I think absolutely dwarfs the number of pilots you'd see in any other industry. So this trope that construction is slow, I think is a little misplaced. Point to the other place where drones are used. So they found immediate use in drones, and all of a sudden they're everywhere. I mean, I'm overstating it. I think the issue with construction is because it's a tight P&L that is very tightly, like you can see how the budget and activities relate to each other more tightly than I think is true in a lot of other industries. So if there isn't day one value, nobody's going to learn on their project how to use this thing. So I think a lot of what has slowed some of the things that might drive technology is that if it wasn't immediately useful and the cost of learning it wasn't close to zero, they're like, you know what, great idea, we'll do it another time. So I think that the bar for adoption is just really like it better add value on Monday, or unfortunately I can't afford to do that. Some of the things that the innovation teams do though is provide a little of that buffer where they can create either a kind of a fake pilot, or they can support a project team either with money or with manpower. So that's overcoming that a little bit. But I think this idea that there's a couple things. You know, in the 1980s, there was a professor who I think is still around called Robert Solow, and he said, look, we've been investing in IT since 1971, and where's the productivity? It was called the productivity paradox or Solow's paradox, depending on which cheerleader you were listening to. The point he made was that he was ringing the bell as an economics professor, but what came out of that was you can adopt all the technology, but until the human processes change, all you're doing is tightening and a little bit of optimizing. So I think what happened in the 90s across certainly the manufacturing sector, but service sectors as well a little bit later, is process reengineering. You know, the core competence of all these things that sounded like buzzwords, but they were really about changing how you do things in the presence of technology. So I think there's a wave of change in how things get done in construction that we can't point to yet, because I don't think anyone's figured it out. But at some point, this amount of data, this amount of technology is going to lead to fundamental changes in how things get done. And then you'll start to see productivity in aggregate change. I also think that the way taking productivity from civil and from commercial and from home building, those are pretty different activities to try to lump together. So I don't love that one. But your central question about why is it slow? I don't know that it is slow, but I will tell you, adopting new technology in the middle of a project is almost you should assume that won't happen very often unless something's really broken. Because they've got what they have and they've got their people, and let's go execute and try not to lose money. So I think that is definitely something that makes it slow. Is you've got 50 or 100 or 1,000 projects going on at once, all not lined up with each other. So it's hard to have an enterprise-wide adoption. But I do think there's a lot of technology being tried. There's a lot of it being deployed. So much so that the average person in the field is like, dude, not another app.
You know what? It's absolutely incredible what you're saying. How do we keep those standards up to date with this evolving technology? And you were just saying, that there's a lot of different pilots on the go right now, and the adoption of these new technologies is evident. But how do we actually build standards to meet that if it's always evolving and adopting? And I think the steel industry, that industry has been around for 40, 50 years. It was actually written to a standard in 2002, and only right now in 2022 or 2021 is it actually had a rewrite and a relook to adopt a new technology to further refine the actual the actual nomenclature and the actual wording of the standard to meet today's need. But really, how would you adapt that, and how like a new technology comes in tomorrow? How do we actually adapt those best practices?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think some of that is going to be up to the company. Well, right now, all of it is up to the company. I do think you'll find some standards with data governance. There are some standards with cybersecurity, SOC 2 being one, FedRAMP being the one that's a little bit more federal, obviously. Somebody has to come together and decide that they were going to invest their time and go fundraise, because it's usually not a company doing this, to create a standard that then is credible. One of the things that I find among contractors is they tend to be very inwardly focused. They trust themselves, and they really don't trust even another. I mean, they trust another one before they trust somebody else, but they tend to want things coming internally. I had an interesting conversation with a bunch of folks doing some analytics at different contractors, and I asked if any of them had talked to the software teams that do dashboards for a living, and they said, no, we grew them all internally. And where they could have gotten someone in for free to teach them best practices, but it just their instinct is to do it internally, because our needs are what our needs are. So I think that, what you're going to find, I believe, is these innovation teams are going to merge with and or augment the IT teams that started off keeping the emails working and keeping the systems working, and are becoming, in some places, very strategic, and in other places, less so. I've seen some presentations from IT teams that were really impressive, and others that are not. So I think that's to answer some of what you meant, is I think it will merge to IT teams who are now thinking it's at least enterprise-wide. And in time, they'll start to think, a little bit more broadly than that, because as IT teams, they'll be talking to each other at a level that's far enough away from projects that nobody feels like it's being, competitive. I think that's the development of the industry.
That's such a great topic, and we can talk about it for hours. I am going to ask you a really important question right now. In terms of what you're doing, and in terms of your move to Austin, do you have your Yeti cup yet? Because as I understand,
there is a massive. It's very funny. There's a massive Yeti place right down the road. I do. In fact, I have more than one Yeti.
Okay, so your transition to Austin is complete.
I also have a favorite taco place. Apparently, that's the other thing.
Well, there we go. Perfect. All right. I did want to take it a little bit to the lighter side. Is there anything else that you've taken from this conversation? Because I know that I have a lot, which I'm going to go back and look at, and a lot of things which you've said have really have made me think, and that's what I love about these conversations. I'm hearing from the broad sector of all the different pieces of the proverbial puzzle. So I'm really, really happy that you were able to join us. David, anything else?
No, Hugh, it was really a pleasure. There was lots of amazing insights that came up during this conversation. Lots that our listeners can learn from about what's happening in the macro level. And I hope that after season 1, we'll bring you again to season 2.
I appreciate you having me. This was a lot of fun. Thank you, guys.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much.